They asked when I planned to move out, before they'd even taken off their shoes. That's when I realized. They thought he left them the house. They thought I was temporary. The house was too quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The kind that presses in around your shoulders and makes every creak in the floorboards sound like a door closing somewhere in your chest. I sat at the kitchen table with a lukewarm cup of tea, watching the steam fade. The sun had just started slipping down behind the oak trees Tom planted when he first moved in, casting long shadows across the garden beds he used to keep so neat. He would have hated seeing the weeds inching in at the edges and made a note to get out there this weekend. It had only been 3 days since the funeral. His shirts still hung in the closet, sleeves folded like waiting arms. His boots were by the back door, as if he might come in any minute and ask what's for dinner. I hadn't moved a thing. Maybe I wouldn't. Maybe that was the point. I was still in the clothes I'd worn to the service. Navy skirt, cream blouse, the pearl clip Tom gave me on our 10th anniversary. I hadn't planned on keeping it in all day, but I couldn't bring myself to take it off either. Every drawer I opened, every cabinet I touched, felt like opening him up again. His things, his scent, his quiet way of living that had become my rhythm too. The knock came just as the sky turned the color of old bruise. Not frantic, just firm. I took a deep breath before opening the door. Brad stood on the porch in a pressed button-up and khakis like he was there for a business meeting. Caroline was behind him, arms crossed, her sleek hair pulled back so tight it looked like it hurt. Her pearls caught the last of the sun. They didn't smile. They didn't hug me. They didn't even say his name. "We were thinking we'd meet with a realtor this week," Brad said, like he was offering to take a load off my shoulders. Caroline glanced over his shoulder, past me and into the house. "It's bigger than I remembered," she said. "Needs updating." I didn't answer right away. I just stepped aside and let them in. The scent of lilies from the funeral still hung in the air. Tom's photo was on the mantel, surrounded by condolence cards and a flickering candle. Neither of them looked at it. Brad sat down like it was already his chair. Caroline wandered the kitchen, opening a drawer without asking. I watched her take stock of my things, like I was a guest who'd overstayed. That's when I knew. They weren't here to grieve. They were here to claim. They were never cruel, just distant, the kind of polite that keeps you in your place. At holidays, Brad would shake my hand like I was someone from church he barely remembered. Caroline would compliment my cooking, then scrape most of it into a napkin when she thought I wasn't looking. They weren't raised to be rude, just raised not to see me. In the early years of my marriage to Tom, I told myself I was imagining it, that they needed time. Divorce is hard on kids, even grown ones. I tried to give them space. I smiled when they called me Miss Delphine instead of just Delphine, the way they did with their old teachers or the women who worked the front desk. I tried not to flinch when they brought up their mother in every conversation, even though she'd been out of the picture for decades. Tom saw it too. He never said much. He wasn't a man of many words, but he always held my hand a little tighter when they were around. Once, after Christmas dinner, I found him alone on the porch, rubbing the back of his neck. He looked out at the dark and said, "They don't know how to be close to people they don't already understand." I just nodded. What was there to say? Still, we invited them every Thanksgiving. Sent birthday cards. I even drove Caroline to a doctor's appointment once when her car broke down. She didn't thank me exactly, just said, "That was helpful," like I'd given her directions. Not my time. I let it go. It was easier that way. I kept hoping something would shift, that one day they'd see the way Tom looked at me, how gentle he was, how he'd leave the porch light on if I was coming home late from choir practice, how he'd slow dance with me in the kitchen when we were both too tired to stand. That kind of love doesn't just happen. It's built, brick by brick. But to them, I was just the woman who came after their mother, a name they added to the family tree with parentheses. Over the years, they came less often. Quick visits, holiday drop-ins. Their voices would rise just slightly when they asked Tom if he was doing okay. I wasn't part of the question. And now? Here they were again. Not for memories, not for their father's guitar or the stack of crossword books by his recliner. No, they were here for square footage, for equity, for the deed. That first night after they left, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the folded flag Tom kept from his Navy days. I thought about all the times I'd told myself they'd come around, all the times I'd let myself be hopeful. I wasn't hopeful anymore. I was ready. They came back the next morning, unannounced. I was in the garden, trimming back the rosemary bush Tom planted 2 summers ago. He used to joke it grew better because I talked to it. I was still in my gloves, dirt under my nails, when I heard the car doors slam. Brad stepped out with a tablet in his hand, walking up the path like he had an appointment to keep. Caroline followed, sunglasses on, carrying a takeaway coffee, like this was just another stop on her to-do list. They barely glanced at the yard Tom loved so much. "We wanted to go over a few things," Brad said, before I even had a chance to greet them. "Timeline stuff." I took off my gloves slowly. "Timeline? Yeah, just... ... What we'll do with the house. Before the market gets soft again," he said, tapping on his screen. "We were thinking it might show better if we paint the inside. Maybe tear out that wall between the kitchen and dining room. Open it up." Caroline nodded, looking around like she was already planning the listing photos. "The kitchen needs work," she said, "but the bones are good." I blinked at them, not quite believing what I was hearing. "You're talking about selling?" They looked at each other. Brad gave a little shrug, like it was obvious. "Well, yeah, I mean, it's a family asset. It makes sense to move quickly." I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger yet. Something heavier. Something older. "Brad," I said carefully, "this is my home." He smiled the way people do when they're about to explain something they think you're too emotional to understand. "Delphine, we get that this is hard. We do. But the house was Dad's, and now, well, it needs to be handled responsibly." Caroline stepped closer, her tone lighter but no softer. "We just want to make sure everything's done properly. The estate, the taxes, the title transfer. If we get ahead of it now, it'll be easier later." I didn't say anything for a long moment. I just looked at them. Their nice clothes, their practiced expressions, the way they never once asked how I was holding up. To them, I wasn't mourning. I was in the way. "I think there's a misunderstanding," I said finally, voice even. Brad was already glancing at his tablet again. "We'll talk to a lawyer, of course," he said, "just to make sure everything's above board." He didn't wait for me to answer. He was already walking toward the backyard, pointing things out to Caroline like a contractor on a job site. She followed, sipping her coffee, murmuring something about curb appeal. I stood there on the porch, hands still smelling of rosemary and earth, and watched them. They didn't see me, not really, but they were about to. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed with the overhead fan spinning shadows across the ceiling and the hum of the old refrigerator carrying down the hallway. Tom used to snore so softly, I'd forget he was there until he rolled over and reached for my hand in his sleep. I missed that reach more than anything. Their voices stayed in my head, calm, measured, so certain. Brad talking about timelines like I was a squatter. Caroline saying curb appeal in the same tone she used to dismiss my sweet potato pie. I'd known they never accepted me as family, but I hadn't realized how fast they'd erase me entirely. They thought I didn't know how these things worked, thought I was just grieving and would soon realize my place. But I did know. Tom and I had talked about this house more than once. He worried about what would happen to me if something happened to him. Not because he didn't trust me, but because he didn't trust them. And so he did what a good man does. He made a plan. The will was in the lockbox under our bed, where we kept our passports and property deed. We'd updated it 3 years ago after his last health scare. I remembered the notary coming over, the quiet seriousness of it all. Tom wasn't dramatic, he was just careful. And he wanted me to be safe. I got out of bed and knelt down on the floor. The box was still there, cool and heavy in my hands. I opened it slowly, like opening a memory. And there it was, the will with both our names on the front, his signature crisp and deliberate. He had left the house to me, not to be shared, not to be negotiated, sole beneficiary, no confusion. I held it in my lap for a long time, running my fingers over the seal. There was no triumph in it, just relief. Proof of what I already knew in my bones. Proof that he had seen me, really seen me, and had made sure I'd have a place when he was gone. They thought I was unprepared, that I'd go quietly, that I didn't know what I was entitled to. But I wasn't some afterthought in Tom's life. I was his wife. I was his choice, and he had made that clear, even if they refused to see it. The next morning, I called our lawyer, Mr. Jennings. He'd known Tom for years, had done the paperwork for the house back when Tom bought it on a handshake deal. When I told him what Brad and Caroline were saying, he sighed through the phone and said, "You've got nothing to worry about, Delphine. Let me handle this." And so I did. I poured myself a cup of coffee, opened the windows, and watered the front porch ferns. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to explain. I just had to wait for the moment when truth would do all the talking for me. They came back 2 days later, this time with a man in a navy suit. He introduced himself as Martin Feldman. Caroline said his name with the kind of forced cheer people use when they think they're being reasonable. "He's just here to help us get clarity," she said, like this was a customer service dispute. I offered them iced tea. Not because I wanted to, but because this was still my house. And in my house, we show people courtesy, even if they walk in with clipboards and tight smiles. We sat in the living room where Tom used to nap in his recliner after Sunday lunch. The lawyer set up his little briefcase on the coffee table, and Brad immediately started listing concerns. He talked about unsettled ownership, transition of assets, and next steps, like I wasn't sitting right there. Mr. Feldman was polite, at least. He had the decency to look uncertain. "Mrs. Ellis," he said after a pause, "the family has some questions about the estate. They were under the impression that the property would be passed on in accordance with default succession laws." I smiled. Just slightly. Default's a funny word when there's a will. Caroline shifted in her seat. "We just want to make sure everything's been done correctly." I stood up without a word, went to the hall closet, and came back with a copy of the will. Clean, notarized, exactly as it should be. I didn't hand it to them. I placed it in front of Mr. Feldman. He read it carefully. Brad tried to peek over his shoulder, but the lawyer didn't rush. When he looked up, his voice had changed. "This appears to be in perfect order. Your husband made his intentions very clear." I nodded. "Yes, he did." Brad's jaw flexed. Caroline looked like she'd tasted something sour, but they didn't speak, not right away. They just sat there, coming to terms with something they hadn't expected. I wasn't guessing. I wasn't unsure. I wasn't theirs to move aside. "You could have told us," Brad muttered finally. I looked at him then, really looked. "You didn't ask." They didn't stay long after that. Mr. Feldman packed up quietly, offering a thin smile that was more apology than politeness. Brad and Caroline mumbled their goodbyes and walked out into the bright afternoon, like people who had just stepped into sunlight after a storm. Squinting, confused, I stood at the door for a while after they left. The iced tea glasses sat untouched on the coffee table. The will still rested in my hands, but I didn't need to read it again. I walked it back to the closet and tucked it behind the coats, right where Tom and I had always kept important things. Not because I was worried anymore, but because some truths don't need to be proved twice. That evening, after they'd gone, I wandered out into the garden. The sun was low, throwing a golden wash over the lawn. It used to be Tom's favorite time of day, when the light softened and the air smelled like honeysuckle and cut grass. I walked along the stepping stones he laid one summer, barefoot, the way he always said felt best. The garden had changed over the years. The azaleas were bigger now, and the birdbath had a crack down the side, but the wind still moved through the same chimes he hung near the fence. The sound was gentle, like distant laughter. It made me think of how we met. It was 23 years ago. I was standing beside my old Buick in the heat of July, tire flat as a promise gone bad, sweat running down my neck. Tom pulled into the station behind me in his pickup, paint peeling, smile easy. He offered to help without asking for anything in return. I remember the way he knelt beside that tire. Hands steady, not even wiping the sweat from his brow. Later he bought me a soda and told me his name. I didn't tell him mine until he asked the second time, and even then I didn't expect to see him again. But he came back the next day. And the next. Courted me slow, with care. Not grand gestures, just consistency. A ride to church, a sack of peaches left on my porch, a handwritten note folded into the Sunday paper. He was divorced, respectful, never pushed. It took me a long time to trust him with my heart. When I did, he held it like something sacred. We got married in the backyard under the same oak tree that now stretches wide over the lawn. It wasn't a big wedding, just friends, neighbors, the minister from my congregation, and Tom's sister, who came all the way from Michigan. Brad and Caroline didn't show. They said they couldn't make it. I sent them photos anyway. Caroline sent back a thank you note typed on plain stationery. Brad didn't reply at all. Still, Tom never stopped trying with them. He called, wrote letters, sent Christmas cards. Sometimes they called back, sometimes they didn't. But he kept trying. That was the kind of man he was. I reached down and picked a sprig of rosemary, rubbing it between my fingers. The scent rose up, strong and familiar. This garden wasn't just a piece of land. It was a record. Every plant, every stone, every shaded corner bore the imprint of a man who loved quietly but completely. I didn't need to explain that to anyone, not even to his children. But as I stood there, wind brushing my face and the chimes whispering above, I knew one thing for certain. Memory isn't just something you carry. It's something that carries you. And in this place, surrounded by what we built, I wasn't just a widow. I was home. The question didn't come with warning. It was dropped like a stone into the middle of a calm morning. Brad called and asked if they could stop by to clear the air. I said yes because I wanted them to look me in the eye when they tried to twist the truth. I set out fresh mugs and made coffee the way Tom liked it, strong, no sugar. Old habits, I guess. They arrived 20 minutes late and didn't apologize. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one Tom and I had eaten breakfast at for nearly 2 decades. Caroline crossed her legs and folded her hands in her lap. Brad cleared his throat, eyes darting to the walls, the ceiling, everywhere but me. I think we deserve to know what happened, he said finally. With the will. I didn't move. You've seen it. Yeah, but when did he change it? Caroline asked, voice tight. 3 years ago. Brad leaned back in his chair. Right, after his stroke. That was exactly why he changed it, I said, my voice even. He wanted things to be clear. Caroline's lips pressed into a line. He wasn't the same after that stroke. I looked at her, at the careful way she chose her words, the thin edge of her meaning. Brad didn't bother with careful. You had a lot of influence over him by then. There it was, the thing they'd been circling around since the funeral. The accusation, dressed in suggestion. You think I manipulated him, I said plainly. Brad shrugged, as if that softened it. We just don't understand why he wouldn't split things. We're his children. You were his children, I said, but you weren't his partners. You weren't here. Caroline bristled. We visited. When it was convenient, I said. When it didn't interfere with your travel plans or your work dinners. You didn't know his doctor's name. You didn't know he couldn't tie his own shoes by the end. You didn't see the nights he forgot how to hold a fork. I did. The room was quiet except for the tick of the wall clock. He trusted me, I said. Every day in every way. And when it came time to put that trust on paper, he did. Carolyn looked down. Brad stared at the table as if he could find a better version of this story carved into the wood grain. You don't have to like it, I said. But you need to understand something. Tom wasn't confused. He wasn't coerced. He made a decision. Because he knew who stood beside him when it counted. They didn't argue. Not because they believed me, but because they had nothing left to stand on. The truth doesn't ask for permission. They left without finishing their coffee, and I watched from the porch as they walked to their car. Two people who suddenly looked very small in a driveway they once thought they'd inherit. It was Mr. Jennings who suggested we meet with everyone in the same room. Let's end this cleanly, he said over the phone, calm and certain. I trusted him. He'd known Tom long before I came along, had helped him navigate the legal mess of his first divorce, and had drafted the updated will with quiet precision. So, I agreed. We scheduled the meeting for a Tuesday afternoon. They wanted to do it at Mr. Feldman's office, neutral ground, they said, but I insisted they come here. If they were going to question my place, they'd have to do it where Tom and I built a life, not across some polished table in a place that smelled like old paper and air conditioning. I wore the same wrap dress I wore on our last anniversary. The turquoise earrings, too. Tom always said they brought out the warmth in my face. I wasn't dressing up for them. I was dressing for myself. For the woman who had been quiet long enough. They arrived together, Brad in his usual khakis, Caroline in gray slacks and a blouse that looked like it had never been wrinkled. Mr. Feldman followed close behind, carrying a laptop bag and a thin file. Mr. Jennings was already seated on the sofa, sipping the tea I made. We sat in a circle. No desk, no barrier, just eye to eye. Let's begin, Jennings said, opening a folder. We're here to resolve the matter of Tom Ellis's estate and ensure all parties understand the terms of his will. Mr. Feldman gave a short nod. I believe there's been some miscommunication. No, I said quietly. There's been assumption. Jennings laid out the will. Clean, notarized, signed, in the presence of legal witnesses. Tom's signature sat bold at the bottom of the last page. Every clause was deliberate. No ambiguities, no loopholes. Brad leaned forward, scanning the papers like the truth might be different this time. Caroline didn't touch them. Her arms were folded, and her jaw clenched so tightly I thought she might crack a tooth. Tom left everything to Mrs. Ellis, Jennings said plainly. The house, the accounts, all personal property. This was his final legally binding decision. Mr. Feldman didn't argue. Yes, I see that now. So there's no legal basis for contesting the estate, Jennings continued, unless someone wishes to pursue a claim based on coercion or incapacity, which, I must add, would be extremely difficult to prove and likely unsuccessful, given the clarity of this documentation. Caroline's voice was brittle. "You're saying we have no right to anything?" Jennings looked at her with patient kindness. "I'm saying your father made a choice, one that reflects the reality of his life." I looked at both of them then, calm, unshaken. He trusted me when he was alive. That didn't end with his death. They had no words, not real ones, just silence wrapped in pride, and I finally exhaled. I watched the truth settle on their faces. It wasn't loud. There was no outburst, no shouting, no grand accusation. Just a slow unraveling of certainty. Brad sat back in his chair, shoulders stiff, his mouth slightly open, like he was about to speak but couldn't find the shape of the words. His confidence, so steady until now, cracked around the edges. He looked older in that moment, less like a man taking control and more like a boy who'd been told no for the first time and didn't know where to place the blame. Caroline didn't move. She didn't blink. She just sat there, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the tips of her fingers white from pressing too tightly. Her lips had that faint, frozen curve she always wore when she was swallowing anger and trying not to show it. Her expression said everything. This was beneath her, unfair, undignified. Losing, for her, was not just frustrating, it was inconceivable. Neither of them looked at me directly. I suppose it was easier that way, easier to focus on the paperwork, on Mr. Jennings's voice as he read out the final terms, on the corners of the room, anywhere but my eyes. The silence stretched long and thin. Mr. Feldman cleared his throat, packed up his files with the kind of quiet efficiency that comes from knowing there's nothing more to be said. Jennings gave me a small nod, and I answered with one of my own. It was done. Not the grief, not the missing, but the uncertainty. That part, at least, had found its ending. I stood, not abruptly, not for effect, just because it was time. I looked at Brad and Caroline, not with anger, but with a kind of finality. You may not have known him the way I did, I said, but he knew you. And he made his choices with his eyes wide open. Brad finally looked up. We were his children, and I was his partner, I replied. Every day, through every struggle, I was the one who held him when he was too tired to walk. I was the one who knew how he liked his coffee. I was the one he asked to stay. Caroline stood slowly, her bag already over her shoulder. She didn't argue. She didn't apologize either. He always said you were strong, she murmured, and for a brief second there was something almost human in her voice. Then she turned and walked out the door without another word. Brad followed behind her, slower, still holding onto the folder with the will, as if it might change when he looked again. I didn't follow them. I didn't have to. Mr. Jennings reached for his coat and said softly, Tom would have been proud of how you handled that. I smiled, not wide, just enough. I didn't need to fight, I said. The truth spoke loud enough. When the door shut behind them, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel victorious. I felt quiet, steady, but emptied in a way that comes from holding firm longer than anyone expected you to. I stood in the entryway for a long moment, listening to the sound of their footsteps fade down the front walk, the car doors clicking shut, the ignition starting. They didn't look back. I turned off the porch light. Not to be cold, just because they no longer needed its glow. I had left it on for them out of habit. Some part of me still believed that being decent, being welcoming, would mean something. Maybe it did. Maybe not. The living room was exactly as it had been before they arrived, but it felt lighter now. The air wasn't so thick. The weight of waiting, of wondering when the next knock would come, had lifted. The chairs they sat in looked untouched, as if the last few weeks hadn't happened at all. But the house remembered. I walked through the kitchen and opened the back door. The evening air met me like an old friend, cool, soft, honest. The porch lights out back hummed gently. I stepped down barefoot, feeling the warmth of the wood under my feet. This had always been Tom's favorite part of the house. He used to sit out here in the evenings, legs stretched, newspaper folded in his lap, humming to himself without realizing. I sat where he used to sit, looked out at the yard that had seen barbecues, birthday parties, and long, quiet nights with nothing but the stars and the sound of wind through the oak branches. We'd built something here, not with bricks and blueprints, but with time, with shared mornings, with forgiveness and comfort and laughter that came easy. They never saw it. Not really. They saw walls and furniture, fixtures, property. But this place, this home, was more than a house. It was where my life was rooted, where Tom left not just a will, but 1,000 signs of love in every drawer, every shelf, every mark on the wall. I closed my eyes and breathed in. The scent of night jasmine drifted in from the fence line. The garden needed watering, but it would wait. Everything could wait. Later I went back inside, poured the rest of the untouched coffee down the sink, and washed the mugs. Small motions. Steady hands, no shaking, no second guessing. I put the cups back in the cabinet, wiped down the counter, and turned off the kitchen light. Then I walked through the house, room by room, and paused at each threshold. Not as a guard, but as a keeper, a witness, a wife. I had nothing to prove anymore. They had come to take something they thought belonged to them. But they left with nothing because what they wanted couldn't be inherited. It had to be earned, and Tom had already given it, freely, to me. The next morning I opened the closet in Tom's old study, not to clean, not to organize, but because something had nudged me in the night. A feeling, soft but insistent, like a voice from beneath the floorboards asking to be heard. It wasn't grief. It was curiosity, the quiet kind that comes after you've settled your battles. Inside the closet, tucked behind a stack of worn manila folders and a winter coat he hadn't worn in years, was a cardboard box I didn't recognize. It was labeled in Tom's handwriting, Personal 2018. I carried it to the desk and opened it slowly, careful not to tear the corners. Inside were envelopes. Dozens of them, some sealed, some not. Each was addressed to Brad or Caroline. I sat down and began to read. The letters weren't angry. They weren't full of blame. They were just honest. Tom had written to them about his hopes, his regrets, his longing to be closer. He told Brad about the guitar he bought but never learned to play. He told Caroline how proud he was when she got promoted, even though she hadn't called to tell him herself. He'd found out through a friend. There was one letter, dated the year after his stroke, that broke something inside me. In it, Tom wrote, I know I haven't always been the father you wanted, but I've tried to be better, especially now. I wish you could see the life Delphine and I have made. I wish you'd let yourself be part of it. Some of the envelopes were never sealed. Maybe he'd written them and lost the nerve. Maybe he hoped things would get better and the letters wouldn't be needed. I read each one, slowly, letting the weight of his words settle. This wasn't evidence. It wasn't leverage. It was something else entirely. A record of a man who tried. A man who reached out again and again, even when nothing came back. When I finished, I put the letters back in the box. I didn't seal it. I didn't lock it away. But I didn't plan to give it to them either. They wouldn't understand. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Instead, I took the box outside just as the sun was beginning to set. I built a small fire in the iron pit Tom used for roasting marshmallows with the neighbors' kids. One by one, I fed the letters to the flame. not out of spite, not out of vengeance, but because they didn't need to sit in silence any longer. Ash rose into the evening air, curling and drifting like old breath finally released. I stayed until the last ember died out. Then I went inside, washed the smell of smoke from my hands, and sat in the living room with the lamp on low. Tom had tried to make peace. I had shown them the truth. That was all either of us could do. The rest was theirs to carry. 2 weeks later, I sent out the invitations. Not through email or group text, but with proper cards, handwritten, each one sealed with care. I invited neighbors, friends from church, folks Tom used to fish with, and the man who cut our lawn every second Saturday. I didn't send one to Brad or Caroline. This wasn't a funeral. It wasn't for grieving. It was a celebration. For the people who had really known him. I set everything up in the backyard, just like Tom would have wanted. Folding tables under the oak tree, citronella candles flickering in mason jars, and string lights hanging low across the fence line. I made sweet tea by the gallon, laid out pitchers of lemonade, and asked everyone to bring a dish if they could. No speeches I'd written, just music and memories. The sun was warm that day, the kind of warmth that settles into your shoulders and makes you slow down. I wore my turquoise wrap dress and left my hair loose. Tom always said it looked best that way, like the sea on a calm morning. People started arriving just after 2. Laughter came in waves, soft at first, then rising. Someone brought a basket of Tom's favorite biscuits. Someone else played jazz from a small speaker tucked under the table, the kind of music he liked to hum while reading the newspaper. They brought stories. Not just the kind you tell at gatherings, but the kind that live at the back of the throat. Mr. Calhoun from across the street talked about how Tom helped him rewire his porch lights during a thunderstorm. Sister May from church recalled the time Tom quietly paid for a family's groceries when they came up short. No big fuss. Just a folded 20 slipped into the cashier's hand and a quick nod. People remembered the way he laughed, low and unhurried. The way he always said, "I hear you," instead of just, "I understand." The way he made space for silence and never rushed a goodbye. I walked through the yard with a pitcher in one hand and a plate of pie in the other, listening, smiling, sometimes laughing until tears came. And when the sun began to dip, and someone turned on the porch light out of habit, I looked around and felt something shift inside me. Not closure, not quite, but a loosening, a gentling. As the last guests trickled out, Sister May hugged me and whispered, "You loved him, right? You can tell by the way you carry him." That night, I stood alone in the yard, lights still glowing overhead. The scent of grilled corn and garden soil lingered in the air. I didn't feel alone. I felt surrounded by something deeper than memory. Love like that doesn't end. It plants itself, it grows, it gathers, and on that warm night, it bloomed. The house didn't change after they left. No loud victory, no sudden brightness. Just the same walls, the same soft creak of the hallway floor in the morning, the same scent of coffee rising from the kitchen. But something in me had shifted. I no longer tiptoed through the silence. I moved through it like someone who belonged. Every morning, I opened the curtains wide and let the light in, the way Tom used to. He believed in sunlight and honesty, in fixing things before they broke, and in speaking love through action. I kept that rhythm. I kept him in the way I swept the porch and pruned the garden, in the way I hummed while folding laundry, in the way I left his slippers by the back door, not as a shrine, just as a gesture, as if he might still come in through the kitchen, shaking dew off his boots. I thought about all the quiet choices that built our life. None of them grand, just steady. Offering comfort when the world felt too sharp. Saying yes when it was easier to say nothing. Making soup on bad days. Touching his shoulder when he forgot a word. Standing beside him when he didn't feel strong. And in return, he did the same for me, again and again. They didn't see that. His children. They thought love lived in inheritance and holiday cards. But it doesn't. It lives in the days no one notices, the ordinary ones, the ones you can't itemize or claim. Sometimes I wondered if they ever sat with their grief long enough to know it, or if they'd just folded it up and put it away, angry that it hadn't left them anything to hold on to. I didn't wish them pain, but I didn't wish them peace without reckoning either. Some truths deserve to be faced. I spent more time in the garden after that. I planted snapdragons and marigolds, turned the soil by hand. The rosemary bush was thriving, resilient, stubborn, fragrant as ever. I smiled every time I passed it. Tom once said, "We don't get to pick our endings, just how we stand in them." He'd said it after a hard day, when his hands shook more than usual, and he was afraid of what that meant. I'd held his hands in mine and said, "Then we stand together." And we did, right up to the end. Now, I stand alone, but I do it rooted, in memory, in truth. In this house that was never just a structure, it was a story, one that only he and I fully knew. I don't expect anyone else to understand the weight of that, but I carry it lightly, with love, because it was given freely, and because no one, not a lawyer, not a child, not even time, can take away a home that was built on love, spoken softly, and choices made without applause.